welcome to Cloud 9fin. I'm Tom Quinn. I'm here with Yiwen Liu. We're both reporters at 9fin, and we're interviewing David Hahn today. David is a partner at Davis Polk in the finance division. David, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk about Snooze Lose. But before we jump into that, can you give us a little bit of a background into you, your practice, and Davis Polk?
Yeah, sure. So I've been practicing since '08. I started my career doing a mix of capital markets work and leverage loan, lender side work, principally all syndicated. Did that for a number of years. Joined Davis Polk in 2017. So I've been with us since then. I was counsel for a couple of years and then got promoted to partner in 2021. These days, my practice mix has shifted a bit. It shifted when I joined us. It's all still principally lender side. It's split between private credit and syndicated. I would say it's sort of on balance 50-50. It moves around in any given year based on market conditions. But that's sort of the bulk of my practice. And then I do a smidge of sort of more distressed restructuring type work, usually working with ad hoc groups, existing agents, liability management transactions, that sort of stuff. So that's sort of how my practice has evolved and where it sits today.
Great. So you're a great person to talk about this new provision in the syndicated market. It's something that we've been following. It's called Snooze Lose. And specifically, we've seen it clear in CDNR and Vista deals. But it seems to be a new provision that affects voting rights. And obviously, we can't ask you about any specific credit, but can you give us an overview of what is this, what is Snooze Lose, and how it's come to the U.S. market?
Yeah, sure, of course. Happy to talk about it in general. So the provision, as you noted, is, of course, something that was historically in European deals. It's well accepted over there, and the market has absorbed it and knows that that's the base case for their deals. In the States, it's a newer feature, as you said. It's more novel. It's been requested by other top-tier sponsors in their papers and their credit agreements. Sometimes it's flexed out of deals that launch. There is often flex to remove this provision in commitment papers when you see it. It has cleared in some, though, but it is being increasingly requested. It's something that, obviously, when a top player in the space is seeking a provision, word of it gets out, and other players are attracted to it as well and want to seek that flexibility. And there's sophisticated counsel who are aware of all this too, who are asking for that on behalf of the sponsors. So it is becoming more prevalent, at least as a requested term, even if it is still more slow to be adopted into actual definitive documentation at this stage. What the provision ultimately does is it changes the way that voting mechanics work for lenders. Historically, lenders have always had the option to just sort of remain silent on an amendment request, whether it's a required lender, majority lender vote, or some sort of sacred right that's being requested. Lenders could just choose to sit silent, and that's effectively treated as a no. What this does is completely upend that, shift the paradigm, and now give more flexibility to borrowers to say, okay, if someone hasn't responded, we have some options here. We can treat that as a yes by adjusting the denominator. We can treat it as a consent outright, a deemed consent effectively, or in some instances, there's a version of this that actually allows them to treat the lender as a non-consenting lender and thus subject to the Yanka Bank. It depends on the formulation you're looking at, but it's some combination of those features, with the end result just being a complete fundamental shift in the way that voting works for lenders who, historically have had a very different regime to operate under.
So you mentioned that this has been in Europe for a while. Why is it important and I guess contentious in the U.S. market?
So it's important for borrowers in the sense that, particularly if you're trying to get through a 100% vote, a maturity extension, for example, any holdout is going to result in issues for a borrower, right? You now haven't achieved the effective maturity extension that you're looking for. You have some small stub that's left over that is early maturing debt that you now have to deal with. And you're publicly saying to people, or frankly, even if it's not a public deal, you're outwardly saying that you weren't able to achieve the maturity extension that you sought. And ultimately, that can have a lot of implications for borrowers. I mean, it can look, again, bad to vendors, suppliers, the other lenders, other creditors of the company. And then in addition, it can also have other consequences for them in terms of if you don't achieve the maturity extension, say, and you're getting your audit done and the earlier maturing debt is coming due within a year, you may now have a going concern issue in your audit, right? And there's something needs to be done with that stub. You have to take it out in some way. And if there really is a liquidity issue, you've now got to come up with liquidity, outside capital, to sort of solve that stub there. So it's important flexibility for borrowers to be able to get to the right result that they're looking for, particularly on 100% votes. Well, for lenders on the flip side, it's important because a lot of smaller lenders in particular, but lenders generally have relied on this notion that if I don't respond, I'm not going to be deemed to have voted yes. I can't be taken out of the credit and lose my investment. And I can just sort of rely on others to police this, right? And if there's enough momentum, say, and it is a 100% vote, it gives people time to get behind it and get supportive and to see how things are unfolding. This changes that, right? There's often a short period. It's typically 10 business days after which someone is deemed to have voted yes and is being dragged. And there's other implications too that we can talk about in a minute, particularly for CLOs and other funds that might be like past the reinvestment window or might have other conditions attached to agreeing to these sorts of requests where now they've sort of lost their authority, their independence, their autonomy to vote on these. And they actually have their own underlying investors that they have to report to. So it's important to lenders for a variety of reasons along the lines of what I just mentioned. But I think the most important thing to go back to is the key takeaway is it's just completely changing their set of expectations and how they might have to track and monitor their investments when there is an amendment request.
Right. But I guess if I'm listening and I've been in the Europe market, I might know that this has existed for a little bit in the Europe market and it's new here. Why is it different when you cross the ocean? Why can't you just port this clause to the US?
It's a really good question. So some of the managers are different, even if it's the same institution. And even though you would think Europe and the States should have similar terms, there are terms over in Europe that are typically more aggressive terms that have been there for some time that do slowly migrate over here. Subordinated shareholder loans being used as an equity cure, things of that nature, have been very common over there, and it's just well established. And there's a different set of people even within an institution. Let's say you're Fund A, and there's a pocket in the States that's going to handle the U.S. investments typically, and a pocket in Europe that's going to handle the European investments. So it's not necessarily the same people. And those expectations among the people who are responsible for managing it are inevitably going to be different too. But I do think you raise a good point, Tom, in that there are institutions who are going to be more inclined to be able to grapple with this and say, look, I institutionally understand this, even if it is a different pocket that's handling the U.S. investments. And that won't always be the case, but it often is. But more generally, the institution writ large might be able to absorb that change and adapt to it more easily than someone who doesn't invest in Europe. And there's plenty of US only investors. And so those folks have no familiarity with this whatsoever. But I do think you raise a good point that there's going to be very different outcomes for different investors depending on their governance stocks, their own setup, which pockets they're investing from. Do they have European exposure where they're accustomed to this, where that they can draw from, even if it's a different set of colleagues, right, where they can quickly adapt. For others, they may not have that functionality and that experience and legacy knowledge to tap into at all.
Are formulations of the language also like different in Europe and in the US? Like you mentioned that there are several different formulations of the language, like lenders can be deemed as consenting, or they could be removed from denominator, or they can be deemed as non-consenting. Tell us just a little bit about the difference between those three.
Yeah, my understanding is it varies over there too, depending on the sponsor and their form. And you can see kind of all three of those options or a subset of them, any one, two, or three of them, depending on the deal you pick up. I think, generally speaking, though, I think that non-consenting yank option is a more recent evolution of this, even over in Europe. I think historically, it was just the ability to drag people by counting them as a yes or adjusting the denominator. I still think that the yank is a newer feature. It is a yank at par, not at whatever the trading price is or some of the other features you see of a yank in connection with DQ provisions, for example. So it is at least at par. But for folks who are planning to hold this investment and think that, in the example of an amend extend transaction, if you're a fund manager and you believe that the credit is good and that this is a good outcome to stick around it, the notion of being silent and getting yanked at par, again, completely alters that for you, where now you've lost the investment, and that might be an outcome that's not desirable.
Right. So it sounds like there's kind of two formulations of the language that have cleared in the U.S. market that 9fin's aware of. The first is that you just remove the lenders, the non-responding lenders from the denominator. So instead of having 100% in the denominator, 10% don't respond. Now you just need to get to 45% to get to a 50% threshold of the 90 that are now in the denominator. The second one is, I think, what we've been talking about, which is you have three ways of voting. You basically vote for the lender. You say they're consenting, you remove them from the denominator, or you say non-consenting. Does this apply to all votes, or I think you've said this now, but sacred right, you're not free from this if it's a sacred rights vote. That still applies to kind of this snooze-lose provision. Right?
That's right. And I think that's why it's been a little bit of a flashpoint, if you will, so far, where there is such intense focus on it by arrangers of loans, thinking ahead to sort of what the marketing process is going to be like and how the market's going to react to, this provision being a feature in one of their deals. That's precisely right. I mean, the moment you're touching voting in general, people's antenna go up, right? Where there's some sort of change there. And then this is such a huge, complete reorientation and reordering of the voting mechanics that's why it's getting a lot of attention. And also because it implicates sacred rights. If you carved out sacred rights from this, I think, first of all, borrowers would sort of lose the advantage they're really trying to get, which is truly on the maturity extensions. I mean, look, it certainly helps for a majority vote too, but I think borrowers often have other levers to pull. Can lean on relationships they have with people, the flow that they're going to have, the ongoing flow, and the ability to push sort of the larger players to participate on the expectation that they're a good partner, right? That they have other investments that they involve these people in. And so I think it's more relevant for sacred rights. And that's where the tension really resides, in that now lenders are having to focus on situations where if they frankly stayed silent before, someone would have to come back to them. And that's no longer the case. And for some of the other reasons we mentioned, where there may be a desire to stay in a particular credit, and now you might get yanked out of it solely because you don't respond to a sacred right request. And there's also, there's nothing that says in these provisions that if let's say it's a 10 business day period, the time frame passes and you come forward and you want to change your vote, that you have a period of time to do that, right? Sort of the ship has sailed. Now you could
you're out. Yeah. If you don't respond by that 10 days, you're done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in theory, if you were getting yanked, I guess, there's a period of time before that settles. You could maybe place some phone calls and try to work the relationship. But I have to think at that point, you have to expect that you're going to be yanked.
So I feel like we've been talking a lot about like this series. So let's say like a clause like this did get passed. Who is responsible for policing that? Like, what is the role of like bank agents, for example, on this?
Yeah, it's ultimately going to be arrangers and administrative agents. And that's why in more recent iterations of it that are showing up in term sheets, there's, in addition to just saying this is the provision that's going to appear in the voting section in the credit agreement, a lot of them lately are going further and saying when anything gets posted to the lenders, here is the language that is going to be in the posting packet. And it's, bold, red font, all caps. And it specifically lays out that the lender has 10 business days to respond to what the consequences of not responding are and staying silent. So it well documents the snooze drag provision, and I think hopefully helps insulate the agent and arranger from any sort of suggestion that this was not put front and center in front of lenders and that they weren't on notice that this was going to be in the document. So it's certainly helpful to have it in like a marketing term sheet, for example. And I actually think it's wise to have that language pre-agreed, because ultimately posting memos are generally, as we all know, from the agent bank, or if there's a lead arranger that's different than the agent bank saying a subsequent incremental, it's from whoever's marketing the debt, and from the agent if it's a subsequent amendment where the agent has to actually consent to it too. So one of them is, or both are communicating to the lenders that this is the amendment request. In certain limited cases, it's a posting memo from the borrower. I haven't seen this provision suggest that the borrower's the one posting it. I don't think that's kind of necessary under these circumstances, particularly if you have that language in there that just makes abundantly clear that this is how the voting works. And that's why it's important, I think, if you can have it in a marketing term sheet, to have it pre-agreed with the borrower, that this is what's going to appear in there to put lenders on notice, and then also subsequently put that in the credit agreement. Because at the end of the day, again, even if the borrower's not the one posting this package, their name's on it, right? And oftentimes they will ask, not always, but I've seen, sponsors and borrowers and their counsel ask to review what we're posting, even the posting memo. And I think you just don't want to dispute over how are we communicating this to lenders. So it's better to have everyone on the same page up front if you are going to have that feature.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? So from the borrower's perspective, they're putting this language in all caps in the credit agreement, then it's in the marketing documents, then it's in the postings, whatever they decide they want. So from a borrower, they're really trying, but it's a unique scenario where not every credit is going to have this language. So there's the old kind of regime of ways to do this, and then that combines with the new regime. So there's two separate types of voting rights that you can have on any of these deals, and you might be in many deals, especially if you're a smaller lender. So can you talk a little bit about, like, if you're a lender, now you're kind of having to navigate this new administrative situation where not every deal is going to have the same voting situation, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you effectively have to create a tracker for this and have a team that's monitoring it and understanding which of your investments fall in which bucket, right? And then you have to more actively continue to supervise your investments when there is an amendment request that fall into the camp of snooze drag. And there may need to be extra resources put behind that, or reallocating of existing resources, and it's going to take up bandwidth. So there is a real practical impact on the back end, I think, for lenders who are in this. It'd almost be easier if you could imagine a world where you just like flip a switch and you pivot everything over, right? All the existing debt that's out there, all the new debt. Even if you did it just go forward in new financings, lenders still have to track which bucket it falls into until all the old investments roll off that no longer have that feature. That's what's challenging about it, right? Is that now folks have to have investments in multiple different categories. There's lots of, to your point, amendment requests along the way in the life cycle of a deal. They're not all going to be sacred rights amendments and a maturity request, but this has implications even for required lender votes. Maybe there's a situation where it's teetering at 49% and a couple of small holders who normally would just trust the bigger holders to make the decisions for them on majority votes suddenly tip the scales. And now all of a sudden, maybe, I'm not going to say contentious, but less widely accepted majority lender request on something that's a little bit more challenging is suddenly sailing through, and just maybe by the skin of their teeth. So it does matter for practical reasons too. It's not just some sort of technical point that lawyers are arguing about and thinking about academically. I think it really does ultimately drive some consequences besides just sort of how is the investment affected, but like how do I set up my institution? What resources am I dedicating to this? How much am I expending energy-wise on tracking this? And that's the hard part, because you really have to look more closely even at the majority lender votes if you're a holder to determine how you're responding, because you don't want to end up in a situation where for a variety of reasons you're sort of not getting the outcome you expected, which could be not just ending up in a situation where you fall into the snooze drag provision and either get dragged on something or get yanked, but it also could have relationship impact, right? If you're someone who doesn't respond, you might be disfavored now by that particular sponsor, where you wouldn't necessarily have that lens focused on you previously if you had the ability to just stay silent. And that could have a broader impact for subsequent financings too, ability to participate in them. I can't say I've seen this, but maybe it ends up, tainting a relationship in a way where, now that that investor is on a DQ list and can't participate in subsequent financings, and they didn't have any intent to cause that sort of hostility. And now it's created just by virtue of this provision. So there's a lot of knock-on effects of it. And I think it's a much simpler analysis from the borrower and sponsor standpoint of this is what this provision accomplishes for me. It has a vast set of consequences for lenders that aren't things that affect the borrower in the same way. The borrower is sort of using this as a tool for one specific purpose.
Right. I'm curious, are, I guess, majority lenders and smaller holders approaching this differently? Because historically, as you were mentioning, it seems like smaller holders had the luxury of kind of just tagging along, and if they just wanted to like write on with the group. Although like this provision also gives lender the option to opt out, and I feel like the formulation here of like demon non-consenting kind of changes this dynamic. Just curious if you can talk a little bit about the difference there.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, normally the yank, as we all know, is specific to votes where you have to get 100%, right? And you're clearing a majority, and now you have to get from majority to 100%, and you're looking to plug the gap that you haven't been able to achieve with either existing lenders taking on that exposure or new lenders coming in through the yank, right? This provision just says even for direct lender votes that these folks can be treated as the non-responders can be treated as non-consenting. So that's also a more aggressive twist than the typical paradigm under a credit agreement, right? It's now allowing people to have their investment pulled when they don't respond to just a majority vote. And you're 100% right. Smaller holders, for the obvious reasons, right? I mean, they know that they're a smaller player. They're more focused on their larger investments just naturally, right? Because those have more of an impact on their organization. They're sitting there and looking to the larger holders to make the tougher investment decisions and to spend the time analyzing these requests. If it's something simple, maybe it's easier, and it's not going to impose as much of a burden on people to respond to. But if it's a detailed amendment, maybe it's not a maturity extension like we've been talking about, but maybe it's a bunch of different changes throughout a credit agreement that have to do with sort of rethinking how the borrower is approaching its covenants more holistically. Maybe there's a big acquisition, and as a result, they're fundamentally changing a lot of things. Or conversely, maybe they're shrinking and disposing of something, and the covenants are shifting in a way. That can be a much deeper analysis than just one technical change to a provision, and there's an audit extension request or something like that, where it's a little bit easier to understand what's driving it. If there's analysis that has to go into it and diligence that's being done, that is precisely where the smaller holders are looking to the bigger holders to police this, to put it through the motions, and to test it out and see if it makes sense as an investment decision. And I think the notion is if those folks are getting it through investment committee, then it probably is something sensible. But to ask everyone to burden themselves with all of that work to diligence and analyze something that is a more wholesale change of a credit agreement, it could take a while to get those folks up to speed and to sort of download them with all the information they need to make the decision. And you're effectively obligating them to do that, because if they don't, I don't know how you sit there and say as an investor that you've satisfied your duties to your underlying investors, say if you're a CLO, if you haven't done the homework. You can't sort of cheat off of the smart kids' notes anymore, right? That's taking that option away. There's no peeking.
Yeah, you can't lay back and say, okay, I'm gonna let the big guys handle this vote on this credit. I really have to be a part of it, because one of the issues is if you don't respond, you could be deemed as consenting. So even if you're just like, okay, I'm gonna let the big guys go with it, the borrower could effectively change your vote such that the big guys don't have as much power as they used to, when you would just be a no vote if you just didn't respond to something.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, and there's definitely extraterritorialities for CLOs, and we're going to kind of get to that in a sec. But before we get there, is the market okay with this? Like, what's the kind of negotiation like from a lender's perspective? Are they really pushing back hard? I know it's sometimes being put in as a flex. How kind of have people responded to the first few examples of this clearing?
So I would say in every instance we've seen it where it's in commitment papers, there is flex to modify it or take it out. So that's sort of step one. And then, when it is appearing, it's obviously getting flagged, and it's getting a lot of attention and discussion, along with some of the other more prevalent features right now, like high water marking, voting caps, voting concentration limits, things of that nature. So it's one of those hot buttons for sure that is immediately flagged and needs to go through not just the commercial team, but the internal legal team at any bank. That being said, I think that there's some measure of willingness to try it out, depending on the sponsor, depending on the credit, of course, right? If it's a tougher credit, even for a really good sponsor, there might be more reluctance to even try it out with flex. You also have to think ahead to how's the marketing really going to play out here? Whenever we've got a bunch of flex provisions, the banks are always talking to the sponsor and the borrower before you market about, are some of them ones, even though, you may want to get deeper into the marketing before you start pulling the lever on the flex. Are there some in here that we know right off the bat are just not going to go well and could cause the execution to falter? That's really the key thing, right? Everyone's focused on pricing and execution when you're launching. And that is a term, I think, that depending on the credit, depending on the situation, could actually impact your marketing in that way. So I think people are having very educated conversations about this and deeply looking at how it might impact the marketing. But it is always a flex point in our experience. And then there's still a lot of conversation, and it's tough conversation about whether you even put it in papers, or let's say you're doing a best efforts credit agreement, because of the attention it's receiving. And because it's a little bit of a flashpoint right now. And so I think it's a point we spend a lot more time talking about than even some of the other more aggressive features that we're seeing lately, where folks are just quick to say, okay, let's just, as long as we have flex, or we'll try it out in a best efforts marketing process, it's not going to completely derail everything. This is one of those ones that's getting far more attention, and the conversations are longer before you do get to a yes, if you are going to include it, say, with flex to remove. And there's certainly situations where people are saying no too. And it's not like it's just sailing through and getting into every set of papers with flex and the reliance is placed on the flex. There are definitely a lot of cases where there's a conversation between the bankers and the sponsor after we flag it, and it just comes out. And there's deals where it's been in marketing term sheet, for example, and we've not seen the launch go off with it. Either it gets flexed out right off the bat, as we talked about, as part of the syndication strategy discussions that happen right before launch, or in a best efforts deal, there's just a decision made that it's not worth it, even if it was in the marketing term sheet. Maybe the pre-marketing feedback you've received before you post a credit agreement is such that it's dead on arrival.
So there seems to be an externality here too, as well, with CLOs, because there can be some governance issues like way down the line when you talk about the CLOs that maybe wasn't at the top of mind when this hit the market. Can you talk to us a little bit about like what those issues might be?
Yeah, and it's really important, and it is a driver behind the reaction to this too, that I think sponsors and borrowers may have thought about, but probably weren't poring over with the same level of analysis that funds who actually have these governance restrictions are so inclined to do a deeper analysis. So the issue there is CLOs have investment periods, and what may happen is there's a request for an amend and extend, say, a CLO's in that credit. Even if they like the credit and think the right result is to roll, they may have governance restrictions on their investment period expiring and the ability to roll into an amended and extended deal. CLO governance docs can differ on this. There are some that give fund managers the ability to stay silent, and they've often been wired that way. There's now, in reaction to this, and I understand this is played out in Europe too, but it's as part of this conversation, it's an ongoing dialogue in the States too, as to whether those CLOs need to adjust their governance docs to require, not permit, but require the managers to say no in certain circumstances, or conversely to say yes in certain circumstances. And CLOs also have different risk profiles, right? I mean, there's some that are doing, sort of AAA, their notes are AAA rated, and they're sort of taking a less risky approach. There are others that are taking a more risky slice and are willing to be more flexible. So it does depend very much on the institution in question and what its investment thesis is. But the notion is not just sort of the reinvestment period, but going deeper. The CLOs are putting out rated notes, right? And those rated notes also have their own expiry. And if the maturity of the underlying loan obligation is going to extend past the expiry of the rated notes that the CLO issues, that can cause problems for the CLO and for its underlying investors. Sometimes the CLO governance docs have weighted average life to maturity and maturity restrictions, again, tying to those notes that they issue. And historically, again, even if those conditions were going to be violated, there was the ability to stay silent and just roll. And so this could also trigger changes in governance docs, where, particularly due to what the underlying CLO investors think, right? Because if you're a CLO manager and you get dragged on something and the investors are furious afterwards, even if the manager thinks it's the right move and a good investment, you've now got an issue of, did you satisfy your duties that you owe to your underlying investors? And again, it very much may depend on what the investment philosophy of the CLO is. And if it's something where they're looking for more higher rated exposure, and they're getting dragged into something that's now riskier. That's, I think, where in particular it could be problematic. But ultimately, you've got this give and take with the underlying maturity restrictions and sort of it not aligning with that, even if managers have the ability to stay silent. And now that this provision has gotten so much attention, the CLO investors are focused on this and are talking to managers about whether that in fact should be the case, if they should be able to remain silent. So it has real implications there too. And I think it's not just unique to CLOs. I mean, any lender is going to have its own governance setup. It's more pronounced for CLOs given that they put out the rated notes. But this could be an issue for any investor. And to the point we were talking about earlier of having to police this, monitor it, put resources into it, you're potentially now having to, as a loan investor, amend your governance docs. There's a cost associated with that. You need to think about how that's going to work. And beyond snooze drag, other implications that may have for amendment requests. And is it something you're doing solely for maturity extension requests, or are you adopting changes to your governance and how you approach amendments more fundamentally and universally? So it has very broad implications, in particular for CFOs or CLOs, but really every loan investor will have to look at their governance docs and make sure that this comports with those.
Right. And specifically, I know we're kind of hitting this point a nail on the head a few times, but the reason that it matters now is because if you were silent before, that was a no, that was non-consenting. But now, if you're silent, you could get dragged because you could be considered consenting. So you're consenting to a maturity extension that you, in your governance docs, should not be consenting to, is basically that main difference here that happened with snooze lose.
And are you going to upset your investors as a result, where you should really be thinking about, even if you as a fund manager believe that, rolling is the right outcome for the investment as a whole, the underlying investors may not share that view. So there's definitely different perspectives that need to be weighed there. And then conversely, if you get yanked, and you really do believe that the answer is to stay in the investment, and now the CLO is losing the benefit of that investment, that can have implications for them too. It could also have implications when they get dragged, say, and they're deemed consenting rather than yanked, and it is a riskier credit. Again, even if they fully believe it's the right decision in the long run, it could result in the CLO's notes getting downgraded too. So that's a very bad outcome for them as well that they want to avoid. So there's a lot of moving parts to think through there. And that's why I think it's a lot harder for lenders to unpack this and why they're focusing on it more. For borrowers and sponsors, it's a much simpler analysis that achieves flexibilities for them that make a lot of sense for them.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, because of this changing, I guess, governance considerations, and also like the fact that we've only seen this in BSL deals, not in private credit deals yet, I'm kind of curious, does this speak to this changing dynamics between lenders and sponsors and the BSL market specifically? Will it be getting closer to like the dynamics we're seeing in private credit? I'm just thinking out loud here.
That's a really great point. I think this is probably something that's specific to syndicated deals, and it will remain that way given the nature of the investors there. But it could be requested at some point in private credit deals. And that's a completely different analysis for them as well, given that they're buy and hold investors. They also have to run it through how they think fund-wise and their own fund governing docs. But typically, as we all know, those deals are more tightly held, right? It could be a sole lender deal or small clubs. There are larger clubs, of course, too, in private credit deals. But I think that private credit providers would think about this and focus on it just as much, if not more so, than banks and arrangers are focusing on it now. We haven't had to deal with that yet. I'm not aware of any situation where it's been proposed in a private credit deal. But I think you're right that this is one of those situations where there's like a clear split on a term between the syndicated and private credit worlds, where we've continued to see in a lot of other circumstances terms being requested in both markets, either simultaneously or first in the syndicated market and then slowly making their way into requests in private credit. And just because of how widely held and widely dispersed syndicated loans are, I think this is a feature that's really kind of more suitable for those, if it's going to go in, right? And in private credit land, I have to think that the philosophy is more, look, like there's a smaller number of partners in here for you, borrower, sponsor X. Come talk to us if there's something that's going on where you need an amendment request, like you would for anything else, and we'll work with you. And there's underlying rules in the road already in those documents for how required lenders work and how voting works, to get to the right result, hopefully for everyone. And then if it's a sacred rights vote in private credit deal, the borrowers and sponsors will still have typically the yank provisions. So I don't know that it's flexibility they'll seek in private credit deals. We'll have to see how it unfolds, but it's a tool that's much more suited towards a syndicated deal.
And I guess with some of the more aggressive like legal clauses that you were mentioning, just to put this into like a broader legal context here, these provisions, they would get through once and then you're kind of set, like you're golden. I'm curious, is this changing the precedent? Like, do you see this as kind of part of the trend, or is there more nuance here?
There's definitely more nuance. That's a great question, because there are a lot of terms, as you said, that once it's in one deal, it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to ultimately be adopted in everything. This isn't one of those provisions so far. I think it's because it touches on voting and sacred rights in part. It's also partly because it's got a catchy name. The moment you can attach a splashy name to something, I do think it gets more attention and people latch onto it more closely. But I think at its core, it's really because it's touching on voting and sacred rights and completely reorientating, as we talked about, how investors have to approach this when they're coming into a deal as a lender. Similar to sort of voting caps, concentration limits. I think those are getting similar treatment. I mean, we've definitely seen those in some deals. They've been in papers, they've been flexed out. There's some examples limited of them getting into deals, but it hasn't resulted in widespread adoption. So this, I think, is one of the examples of a term, at least at the present moment. Obviously, it could shift if the market gets really hot and frothy. Maybe that changes. But for the moment, it appears to be a term that's very case by case. And if it is getting through, it's a conscious decision that particular credit and that particular situation can support at least launching with it. And then the market hasn't pushed back on it, which is probably a testament to the individual credits being good enough that there's, say, an oversubscribed deal and this provision can get through. Whereas in a different situation, it, even for the same sponsor and a different credit, it just might not make it through.
Right. And that's what we're seeing is these more, targeted legal clauses that are entering, like we've been talking about all of them on this podcast. But, as you see the amount of dry powder from lenders go up and a lot of these deals are launching oversubscribed, it can be a way to kind of push the scales a little bit more and see if you can get one of these clauses in. Because at the end of the day, as you said, it comes down to pricing. It comes down to like the very fundamentals of the credit. Plus, if it's oversubscribed, maybe we can get something else past the takedown
right.
by banks.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you're just looking at the order book and is there enough support for it without, with removing people who say are against it clearly and have affirmatively said no, that you can still get to an order book that satisfies the debt need.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. And this has been Cloud9 Fin.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. This was great.